Stand at Dahshur, 15 kilometers south of Giza, and you'll encounter a structure that defies every expectation of what a pyramid should be. The bent pyramid rises from the desert floor with an unusual profile that immediately captures attention, its lower half ascending at a steep 54 degrees before abruptly transitioning to a gentler 43-degree slope about halfway up. This distinctive change in angle gives the monument its modern name and creates a silhouette unlike any other pyramid in Egypt. Yet despite its unique architecture and remarkably preserved exterior, the bent pyramid remains curiously absent from mainstream archaeological discussion. Tour groups bypass it for Giza's more famous monuments. Documentaries dedicate mere minutes to its existence. Academic papers treat it as a footnote, an interesting failure, a construction mistake, a transitional experiment between earlier step pyramids and the true pyramids that followed. This dismissal feels undeserved when you examine what the bent pyramid actually represents: a monument of sophisticated engineering, deliberate design choices, and features so unusual they challenge our understanding of 4th Dynasty construction methods. The bent pyramid was built during the reign of Pharaoh Senefuru, father of Khufu, who would later construct the Great Pyramid at Giza. Senefuru's building program was extraordinarily ambitious. He's credited with constructing at least 3 major pyramids during his approximately 30-year reign, producing more stone monument volume than any other pharaoh in Egyptian history. The bent pyramid stands as the second of these projects, positioned chronologically between the collapsed medium pyramid and the red pyramid, which stands just 2 kilometers north at the same Dahshur site. Traditional Egyptology explains the bent pyramid's distinctive profile through a narrative of engineering crisis. According to this interpretation, builders began construction at the steeper 54-degree angle, but encountered structural problems partway through, perhaps subsidence of the foundation, stress fractures in the masonry, or concerns about the internal chamber's stability. Faced with potential collapse, they supposedly adjusted the design mid-construction, reducing the angle to ensure completion. The result? A monument that appears to be 2 pyramids stacked atop each other, a compromise born of desperation. This explanation has become so entrenched in archaeological literature that few question it. Yet when you examine the physical evidence, numerous details don't fit the narrative of emergency correction. The transition between angles is precise and planned, not hasty. The internal architecture demonstrates sophisticated engineering throughout. The pyramid's exterior casing stones remain largely intact, revealing construction techniques that suggest careful execution rather than panicked adjustment. Most significantly, features exist within this monument that appear nowhere else in pyramid architecture, anomalies that conventional explanations struggle to address. The bent pyramid measures approximately 188 meters along each side of its square base, with an original height estimated at 105 meters. Unlike later pyramids whose smooth casing stones were stripped away over centuries, the bent pyramid retains roughly 80% of its original Tora limestone outer layer. This exceptional preservation allows detailed study of ancient construction methods, revealing how individual stones were shaped, positioned, and joined, information largely lost at more famous sites where only inner core masonry remains visible. The casing stones themselves display remarkable precision. Each block was dressed smooth on its outer face and fitted to its neighbors with joints so tight that modern observers struggle to insert even thin blades between them. The lower courses show stones laid at the steeper 54-degree angle, while upper courses transition to 43 degrees. But here's what makes this transition extraordinary. There's no visible disruption in the stonework quality at the angle change. The blocks above and below this transition point display identical craftsmanship, suggesting the change was planned rather than improvised. The monument's interior is equally unusual, containing not 1, but two separate entrance passages leading to distinct chamber systems. Most pyramids have a single entrance on the north face, following consistent religious and astronomical orientations. The bent pyramid includes a traditional north entrance but also features a second entrance high on its western face, a configuration found nowhere else in pyramid architecture. These two entrance systems don't connect internally, instead leading to separate chambers that appear to serve different purposes. The northern entrance descends through the pyramid's bulk via a passage that maintains a steep angle, eventually reaching a corbelled chamber deep within the structure. This chamber demonstrates sophisticated architectural technique, with walls stepping inward course by course to create a peaked ceiling that distributes weight effectively. The western entrance follows a different trajectory, climbing upward through the pyramid's mass before opening into a second corbelled chamber positioned higher in the structure. Both chambers remain empty of decoration, inscription, or any obvious indication of their intended function. These dual chamber systems raise questions that conventional tomb theory struggles to answer. Why create two separate entrance passages if the pyramid was simply meant to house a single burial? Why position one entrance so unusually high on the western face? Why build two corbelled chambers when one would suffice for a sarcophagus? The standard explanation, that plans changed during construction, doesn't fully account for the deliberate precision with which both systems were executed.
The pyramid's foundation also deserves attention. Unlike the rocky plateau supporting the Giza pyramids, the bent pyramid rises from relatively soft desert sand and clay. Construction on such unstable ground would seem to invite the subsidence problems that supposedly forced the angle change. Yet the monument has stood for 4,500 years without catastrophic failure. The foundation must incorporate engineering techniques that effectively distribute the pyramid's immense weight, preventing the sinking that conventional theory suggests threatened the structure. Modern archaeological investigation of the bent pyramid has been limited compared to work at Giza or other major sites. Extensive excavation and documentation occurred during the 19th and early 20th centuries, but comprehensive modern surveys using contemporary technology remain rare. This relative neglect means many questions about the monument's construction and purpose haven't been systematically explored. Features that might revolutionize our understanding of Fourth Dynasty capabilities go unstudied, while attention focuses on more famous structures whose mysteries have been examined exhaustively. Why does this neglect persist? Part of the answer lies in academic momentum. Once scholarly consensus establishes an interpretation, the bent pyramid as a construction failure, subsequent research tends to reinforce rather than challenge that narrative. Investigations focus on confirming the accepted explanation rather than exploring alternative possibilities. Anomalies that don't fit the story get minimized or ignored. The monument becomes relegated to a supporting role in the larger narrative of pyramid evolution, interesting primarily as a stepping stone to later achievements rather than worthy of study in its own right. Tourism economics also play a role. The bent pyramid sits at Dahshur, a site less developed and less accessible than Giza. Visitor infrastructure is minimal. The journey from Cairo takes longer and offers fewer amenities. For tour operators maximizing limited time, bypassing Dahshur in favor of Giza's concentrated attractions makes business sense. This reduced visitor traffic translates to less public awareness, less pressure for preservation and study, and ultimately less academic and governmental resources allocated to investigation. The dismissal of the bent pyramid as merely a construction error also reflects broader assumptions about ancient capabilities. If we view pyramid building as a process of gradual improvement through trial and error, then failures like the bent pyramid become evidence supporting that narrative. The angle change demonstrates ancient builders' limitations. They tried something too ambitious, encountered problems, and adjusted. This interpretation fits comfortably within our expectations of technological progress. Start simple, experiment, learn from mistakes, improve. But what if this interpretation is wrong? What if the bent pyramid's unusual features aren't errors, but intentional design choices serving purposes we don't understand? What if the dual entrances, the angle change, the separate chamber systems reflect sophisticated planning rather than desperate correction? Examining the monument with fresh perspective reveals details that challenge the failure narrative and suggest something more complex was happening during Sneferu's reign. The preservation of the casing stones offers a unique opportunity. At Giza and most other pyramid sites, only the inner core masonry remains visible, its rough-cut blocks never meant to be seen. The bent pyramid's intact exterior allows us to study exactly how 4th Dynasty masons prepared, transported, and positioned the fine Tura limestone that gave these monuments their smooth, gleaming surfaces. Tool marks on individual stones reveal cutting techniques. Subtle variations in color and texture indicate different quarry sources. The joints between blocks demonstrate fitting methods that achieved precision we struggle to replicate. Yet, despite this preservation, providing unparalleled access to ancient construction methods, detailed analysis remains limited. Comprehensive photographic documentation of the casing stones, systematic measurement of dimensions and angles, chemical analysis of stone composition and tool marks, these fundamental archaeological investigations remain incomplete. We possess a monument that could answer crucial questions about 4th Dynasty capabilities, but we're not asking those questions systematically. The bent pyramid stands as both an architectural marvel and an archaeological mystery. Its distinctive profile challenges us to look beyond comfortable narratives of construction failure and consider alternative explanations for its unusual features. Its preservation offers opportunities for study that more damaged monuments cannot provide. Yet it remains underexamined, understudied, and underappreciated. A pyramid that everyone who visits Egypt passes by, literally and figuratively, on their way to more famous structures. In the following episodes, we'll explore the secrets this monument holds, the mystery of its angle change, the significance of its dual entrances, the purpose of its empty chambers, the sophistication of its construction techniques, and most intriguingly, why certain features and anomalies are rarely discussed in mainstream archaeology. The bent pyramid has stories to tell, if we're willing to listen with open minds and question assumptions that have gone unchallenged for too long.
The most immediately striking feature of the bent pyramid is the abrupt change in its slope angle approximately halfway up the structure. The lower section rises at a steep 54 degrees, 7 minutes, an angle that would create an impressively tall, dramatically pointed monument if continued to the apex. Then, at roughly 47 meters height, the angle suddenly shifts to a gentler 43 degrees, 22 minutes. This transition creates the distinctive, bent profile that gives the monument its modern name and has sparked debate among archaeologists for over a century. The conventional explanation for this angle change centers on structural emergency. According to this theory, builders began construction with the steeper angle but encountered problems that threatened the pyramid's stability. Perhaps the foundation began settling under the enormous weight. Perhaps stress cracks appeared in the internal chamber's corbelled ceilings. Perhaps the builders recognized that continuing at 54 degrees would create forces that the available construction techniques couldn't safely manage. Faced with potential catastrophic failure, they adjusted the design mid-construction, reducing the angle to complete the monument safely. This narrative has become so embedded in archaeological literature that it's presented as established fact rather than interpretive theory. Textbooks describe the bent pyramid as a learning experience for 4th Dynasty engineers, an ambitious project that exceeded their capabilities and forced them to adapt. The monument becomes evidence of trial and error pyramid development, a stepping stone between earlier failures and later successes. Sneferu's subsequent construction of the Red Pyramid at the gentler 43-degree angle supposedly confirms this interpretation. Having learned from the bent pyramid's problems, he played it safe with his next project.
But examine the physical evidence closely, and this explanation begins to unravel. The transition between angles shows none of the signs you'd expect from emergency construction adjustments. There's no disruption in stone quality at the change point, no evidence of hasty modifications to accommodate unexpected alterations, no visible stress fractures or settling damage that would have prompted the change. Instead, the transition appears deliberate and carefully executed, with both sections displaying identical high-quality craftsmanship. The casing stones themselves tell a revealing story. At the angle change, the blocks don't show the irregular fitting or rushed placement you'd associate with crisis management. Each stone is precisely dressed and positioned, its outer face maintaining the smooth profile despite the geometric complexity of transitioning between two different slopes. The upper and lower sections meet cleanly, with careful attention to maintaining structural integrity at this critical juncture. This precision suggests planning, rather than panic. Consider the mathematics involved in changing pyramid angles mid-construction. This isn't a simple adjustment you can make on the fly. Altering the slope requires recalculating the dimensions of every subsequent course of stone, ensuring that blocks at each level properly fit the new angle while maintaining the pyramid's square profile. Workers would need new templates for cutting stones, new measurements for positioning them, new calculations for each course's setback from the one below. Implementing such changes across a massive construction project involving hundreds of workers would require careful planning and organization, not the characteristics of desperate improvisation. The angle change also affects the pyramid's final dimensions in specific ways. If the 54-degree angle had been maintained to the apex, the bent pyramid would have reached approximately 129 meters height, making it taller than the later red pyramid at 104 meters. By reducing to 43 degrees, the final height decreased to approximately 105 meters. This makes the bent and red pyramids nearly identical in height, a similarity that might not be coincidental. Some researchers have noted that the bent pyramid's dual angles create a monument whose volume of stone is remarkably similar to what would have been required for a pyramid built entirely at either angle to the same base dimensions. The steeper lower section uses less material than a gentler slope would, while the upper section's reduced angle compensates. This mathematical relationship suggests the angle change might have been deliberate from the start, designed to achieve specific volumetric or structural properties while creating a distinctive visual profile. The pyramid's internal chambers offer additional clues about the angle change's purpose. Both the northern and western entrance systems were constructed before the angle change occurred, yet neither shows evidence of structural distress that would have prompted the modification. The corbelled ceilings in both chambers remain intact, with no stress fractures or signs of impending failure. The passages maintain consistent dimensions throughout. If structural problems motivated the angle change, you'd expect to see evidence of that distress in the internal architecture. Instead, everything appears stable and deliberately designed. The red pyramid, built immediately after the bent pyramid just 2 kilometers away, maintains a consistent 43-degree angle from base to apex. Traditional interpretation suggests Seneferu chose this gentler slope after learning from the bent pyramid's alleged problems. But consider an alternative possibility. Both pyramids were designed with their respective angles from the start, serving different purposes or incorporating different design philosophies. The bent pyramid's dual angles might reflect deliberate experimentation with structural properties, while the red pyramid's uniform slope represents a different approach to monument design. Flinders Petrie, who conducted extensive surveys at Dahshur in the late 19th century, noted peculiarities about the bent pyramid's foundation that don't align with the subsidence theory. He observed that the pyramid sits on relatively level ground cleared to bedrock in the center, but with foundation trenches filled with sand and gravel at the edges. This construction technique would actually help distribute weight and prevent uneven settling, suggesting the builders anticipated and planned for the challenging ground conditions rather than being surprised by them.
The angle change occurs at a height where the pyramid's mass creates maximum stress on the lower courses. At this point, the cumulative weight of millions of tons of stone presses down on the base with enormous force. If the builders intended to create a structure that tested the limits of their construction techniques, changing the angle at this critical height would be a logical way to reduce stress while still achieving impressive dimensions. This could represent deliberate engineering rather than emergency correction. Another overlooked aspect is the visual impact of the angle change. From ground level, the bent pyramid's distinctive profile creates an optical effect unlike any other pyramid. The eye follows the steep lower slope upward, then encounters the gentler upper section, creating a sense of mass and presence that a uniform angle wouldn't achieve. If aesthetics played any role in pyramid design, and the extraordinary precision of these monuments suggests they did, the bent profile might have been intentionally chosen for its visual impact. Some researchers have proposed that the angle change relates to astronomical or symbolic purposes. The 54-degree lower section might align with specific stellar observations or sacred geometry principles, while the 43-degree upper section serves different symbolic functions. Ancient Egyptian architecture often incorporated multiple layers of meaning: practical, religious, astronomical, and mathematical. The bent pyramid's dual angles could reflect this complexity rather than representing a simple construction error. The timing of construction also matters. Recent analysis of tool marks and construction techniques suggests the pyramid was built relatively quickly by ancient standards, perhaps within 10 to 15 years. This rapid construction timeline argues against the emergency adjustment theory. If serious structural problems arose partway through construction, you'd expect delays while engineers assessed the situation, developed solutions, and modified plans. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests continuous, efficient construction from start to finish. The absence of contemporary Egyptian records describing construction problems is also significant. The bent pyramid was a major royal monument, one of the largest construction projects of its era. If it experienced serious structural crises requiring major design changes, you'd expect some mention in administrative records, inscriptions, or later historical accounts. The silence of the historical record doesn't prove the angle change was planned, but it's consistent with that interpretation. Modern engineering analysis provides additional perspective. Computer modeling of pyramid structures shows that a 54-degree angle, while steeper than most pyramids, wouldn't necessarily result in structural failure with proper construction techniques. The forces involved can be managed through careful stone placement, adequate foundation preparation, and appropriate internal chamber design. The bent pyramid's lower section has stood for 4,500 years without collapse, demonstrating that the steep angle was structurally viable. The deliberate design theory also better explains why Sneferu didn't simply abandon the bent pyramid and start fresh when alleged problems arose. Building a pyramid required enormous resources: quarrying and transporting millions of tons of stone, organizing thousands of workers, dedicating years or decades to construction. If the project truly faced catastrophic structural problems, starting over at a new site with lessons learned might have made more sense than compromising the design of a nearly completed monument. Yet Sneferu finished the bent pyramid and then built the red pyramid nearby, suggesting both projects proceeded according to plan. Perhaps most tellingly, later pyramid builders didn't avoid steep angles because of lessons supposedly learned from the bent pyramid's problems. Some pyramids built after Sneferu's reign employ even steeper angles than 54 degrees at their basis. If the bent pyramid's angle change resulted from structural failure that taught Egyptians the limits of steep construction, subsequent builders wouldn't exceed those limits. Their willingness to build steep pyramids suggests the bent pyramid's design wasn't driven by structural necessity. The angle change mystery deepens when you consider that no other pyramid in Egypt displays this feature. If changing angles mid-construction was a reasonable response to structural problems, you'd expect to see it elsewhere, other pyramids where builders recognized issues and adjusted accordingly. The bent pyramid stands alone with its distinctive profile, suggesting its design represents something unique rather than a repeated solution to common problems. What if the angle change was planned from the beginning? What if Sneferu and his architects deliberately designed a pyramid with two distinct slopes, achieving structural, aesthetic, or symbolic purposes that a uniform angle couldn't accomplish? This interpretation transforms the bent pyramid from a failure to a success, a monument that demonstrates sophisticated engineering and architectural sophistication rather than emergency problem-solving. The conventional wisdom dismisses the bent pyramid as an interesting mistake, a construction error that taught valuable lessons. But the physical evidence supports an alternative narrative, a carefully designed monument incorporating unusual features for deliberate reasons. The angle change might represent advanced understanding of structural forces, aesthetic experimentation, symbolic significance, or purposes we haven't yet recognized.
Rather than being the pyramid everyone ignores because of its flawed design, perhaps it deserves attention precisely because its unusual features challenge our assumptions about ancient capabilities and intentions.
Egyptian pyramids follow a remarkably consistent architectural pattern. Nearly every major pyramid has a single entrance positioned on its northern face, aligned with specific astronomical or religious orientations. This consistency isn't coincidental. It reflects deeply held beliefs about the afterlife, the journey of the deceased pharaoh's soul, and the cosmic order that ancient Egyptians believed governed existence. The northern entrance faces the circumpolar stars, those celestial bodies that never set below the horizon, representing eternal life and the realm where the pharaoh would dwell after death. The bent pyramid violates this sacred pattern. It possesses not one, but two entrances, leading to entirely separate internal systems. The first entrance follows tradition, positioned on the northern face, approximately 12 meters above ground level. But the second entrance breaks every rule, placed high on the western face, approximately 33 meters above the base, in a location that has no parallel in pyramid architecture. This dual entrance system raises fundamental questions about the monument's purpose and challenges our understanding of Fourth Dynasty design principles. Let's examine the northern entrance first, as it represents the more conventional element. A descendant passage cuts through the pyramid's masonry at a steep 24-degree angle, burrowing downward for approximately 75 meters. The passage is narrow, barely over 1 meter high and wide, forcing anyone entering to crouch or crawl. This uncomfortable dimension is typical of pyramid passages, though the reasons for such restrictive sizing remain debated. Some suggest it relates to security, making tomb robbery more difficult. Others propose symbolic significance, representing the difficulty of the journey to the afterlife. The northern descending passage eventually levels out and continues horizontally before opening into the lower chamber. This chamber demonstrates sophisticated corbelling technique, a construction method where each successive course of stone projects slightly inward from the one below, creating a peaked ceiling that rises approximately 17 meters high. The corbelled structure distributes the enormous weight of stone above, preventing collapse while creating an impressively tall interior space. The chamber's floor sits nearly 30 meters below ground level, carved partly from bedrock and partly constructed within the pyramid's mass. This lower chamber contains no decoration, no inscriptions, no obvious preparation for burial. Its walls are rough-cut limestone, showing tool marks but no finishing work. A rectangular pick in the floor suggests preparation for some installation, perhaps a sarcophagus or equipment related to the chamber's function, but the pit remains empty, offering no clues about its intended use. The chamber feels unfinished, as if construction stopped before completion, or as if its purpose didn't require the elaborate decoration typical of burial chambers. Now consider the western entrance, the architectural anomaly that sets the bent pyramid apart from every other pyramid in Egypt. Positioned 33 meters up the western face, this entrance would have been extraordinarily difficult to access, even during construction. Unlike the northern entrance, which could be reached by ramps or scaffolding during building, the western entrance's height and position suggest it was meant to remain difficult to enter after completion. The western passage ascends rather than descends, climbing upward through the pyramid's book at approximately 30 degrees. This upward trajectory is highly unusual. Most pyramid passages descend toward chambers positioned at or below ground level. The western ascending passage extends for approximately 62 meters before opening into the upper chamber. Like its northern counterpart, this chamber employs corbelling technique, creating a peaked ceiling approximately 17 meters high. The craftsmanship matches the lower chamber's quality, with precisely cut stones creating the stepped vault that characterizes corbelled construction.
The upper chamber, like the lower, shows no decoration or inscription. Its walls are rough cut, its floor unfinished. A strange vertical shaft extends upward from the chamber's ceiling, rising approximately 8 meters before ending without apparent purpose. Some researchers suggest this shaft might have been intended to reach the pyramid's exterior, perhaps for ventilation or symbolic connection to the sky, but construction ceased before completion. The shaft's presence adds another layer of mystery to a chamber whose function remains unclear. Here's what makes the dual entrance system particularly puzzling. The two passages don't connect internally. In most pyramids with multiple passages, the corridors eventually intersect, creating an internal network that allows access between different chambers. The bent pyramid's northern and western systems remain completely separate. Someone entering through the northern entrance cannot reach the western chamber without exiting the pyramid and climbing to the western entrance. This separation suggests the two systems served different purposes rather than providing alternative routes to the same destination. Why build two completely independent entrance systems? The conventional explanation suggests construction phasing. Perhaps the northern entrance and lower chamber were built first, then deemed inadequate for some reason, prompting construction of the western entrance and upper chamber. But this theory struggles to explain why builders would create a second complete system rather than modifying or expanding the existing one. The effort required to construct a second entrance high on the western face, cut a 62-meter ascending passage through solid masonry, and build another corbelled chamber would exceed the work needed to modify the northern system. Another theory proposes the dual systems relate to Egyptian beliefs about duality, the northern entrance serving one aspect of the pharaoh's existence, while the western entrance serves another. Ancient Egyptian religion incorporated numerous dualities: Upper and Lower Egypt, the Red Land and the Black Land, the living and the dead. Perhaps the two entrance systems represent an architectural expression of these dualities, with each chamber serving distinct ritual or symbolic functions. The northern entrance might relate to the celestial journey to the circumpolar stars, while the western entrance connects to the solar journey, the west being where the sun sets and enters the underworld each night.
The western entrance's unusual position also raises practical questions. How did workers access this entrance during construction? The pyramid's western face would have been covered with construction ramps or scaffolding during building, but positioning an entrance 33 meters up requires deliberate planning. This entrance couldn't be an afterthought added during construction. It would need to be integrated into the building plan from the beginning, with ramps or scaffolding designed to provide access at that specific height. Some researchers have noted that the western entrance aligns with the pyramid's angle change. The entrance sits just below the point where the slope shifts from 54 to 43 degrees. This positioning might not be coincidental. If the angle change was planned from the beginning, placing the western entrance near this transition point could relate to the structural or symbolic purposes that motivated the dual angle design. The entrance, angle change, and upper chamber might form an integrated system whose full purpose we don't yet understand. The vertical shaft extending upward from the upper chamber deepens the mystery. This shaft was clearly intentional. It's too precisely cut and positioned to be a construction accident or abandoned work, yet it leads nowhere, terminating within the pyramid's bulk. Some speculate it might have been intended as a soul shaft, analogous to the narrow passages extending from chambers in later pyramids like Khufu's Great Pyramid. But those shafts reach the pyramid's exterior, providing a pathway for the deceased spirit to access the sky. The bent pyramid's shaft goes nowhere, serving no obvious practical or symbolic purpose. Modern investigation of both chamber systems has been limited. The bent pyramid's interior was closed to visitors for decades due to concerns about carbon dioxide buildup in the poorly ventilated chambers. Recent work has installed ventilation systems and allowed limited access,
but comprehensive modern surveys using contemporary scanning technology remain incomplete. We possess detailed 19th century measurements and descriptions, but systematic documentation with laser scanning, ground-penetrating radar, or other modern tools could reveal features earlier investigators missed. The rough, unfinished appearance of both chambers has led many archaeologists to conclude the pyramid was never completed. According to this interpretation, Sneferu abandoned the project before finishing the chamber's interior decoration and preparation. But this conclusion assumes pyramids must be completed in a particular way, with decorated chambers, installed sarcophagi, and ritual preparation for burial. What if the chambers were finished according to their actual purpose, which didn't require decoration? The rough walls might be intentional rather than incomplete, serving functions where smooth surfaces or inscriptions weren't necessary. The absence of any burial remains or equipment in either chamber is also significant. No sarcophagus has been found, no canopic chest, no burial goods of any kind. Tomb robbers thoroughly plundered Egyptian pyramids over the centuries, but they typically left fragments, broken pottery, scattered remains, damage from forced entry. The Bent Pyramid's chambers show none of this. They appear not robbed, but simply empty, as if never used for their supposed purpose of housing a royal burial. This emptiness raises a crucial question. Was the Bent Pyramid ever intended as a tomb? The dual entrance system, separate chamber systems, rough, unfinished walls, and complete absence of burial preparation suggest alternative purposes. Perhaps the monument served ritual functions that required multiple chambers for different ceremonies. Perhaps it represented an architectural experiment, testing new construction techniques and internal layouts. Perhaps it encoded symbolic or astronomical meanings that required the specific configuration we see. The relationship between the Bent Pyramid and the nearby Red Pyramid adds another dimension to the mystery. Sneferu built both monuments at Dahshur, separated by only 2 kilometers. The Red Pyramid contains a more conventional internal layout, a single northern entrance leading to 3 chambers, 1 positioned below ground and 2 within the pyramid's mass. This more traditional design might suggest Sneferu returned to conventional pyramid architecture after experimenting with the Bent Pyramid's unusual features. Or it might indicate the 2 pyramids served complementary purposes, with their different internal layouts reflecting different functions within Sneferu's mortuary complex. Some researchers have proposed the Bent Pyramid wasn't Sneferu's final resting place, but rather served as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb where the pharaoh's ka, spiritual essence, could reside while his physical body rested elsewhere. Ancient Egyptian kings sometimes constructed multiple tombs or symbolic burial places at different sites. If the Bent Pyramid served this purpose, its unusual internal layout might reflect requirements different from an actual burial monument. The dual entrance system also relates to questions about pyramid security. Traditional single-entrance pyramids could be sealed after burial by blocking the passage with granite plugs or filling it with rubble. The Bent Pyramid's 2 separate entrances would be far more difficult to secure effectively. Sealing one entrance wouldn't protect the monument's interior if the second remained accessible. This vulnerability to robbery would be unusual if the pyramid was designed to protect a royal burial and its accompanying treasures. The more we examine the Bent Pyramid's dual entrance system, the more it appears deliberate rather than evolutionary. The 2 completely separate passage and chamber systems represent sophisticated design and construction, not haphazard addition of features during building. The western entrance's unusual height and position required careful planning and integration with the overall structure. The chamber's corbelled ceilings demonstrate advanced architectural technique executed with precision in both locations. Perhaps the 2 entrance system's greatest secret is that it questions the fundamental assumption underlying pyramid interpretation, that these monuments primarily served as tombs.
If the bent pyramid was designed from the beginning with two separate internal systems leading to empty, undecorated chambers, perhaps it was built for purposes that had nothing to do with housing a burial. The architecture itself might be the point, creating specific internal spaces with particular properties for functions we don't yet understand.
Step into either of the bent pyramid's corbelled chambers and you'll immediately notice something unusual. The walls are rough, unfinished, showing tool marks and irregular surfaces that seem at odds with the precision of the pyramid's exterior. No hieroglyphic inscriptions guide the deceased through the afterlife. No painted scenes depict the pharaoh's journey to the realm of the gods. No smooth plaster covers the limestone blocks. The chambers appear, by all conventional standards, incomplete, as if construction ceased before workers could finish preparing these spaces for their intended purpose. This apparent incompleteness has led most Egyptologists to conclude that the bent pyramid was abandoned before completion. According to this interpretation, Sneferu's builders never finished the interior work because the project was cut short, perhaps due to the structural problems supposedly requiring the angle change, or perhaps because Sneferu decided to focus resources on constructing the nearby Red Pyramid instead. The rough chamber walls become evidence of a monument left unfinished, a construction project that didn't achieve its final form. But this interpretation deserves closer examination. What does finished actually mean in the context of pyramid construction? Our expectations about how pyramid chambers should look are largely based on later examples, particularly the elaborately decorated tombs in the Valley of the Kings from the New Kingdom period, over 1,000 years after Sneferu's reign. These later tombs feature walls covered with intricate paintings and inscriptions, carefully smoothed and prepared surfaces, and obvious indications of completion. We've projected these later standards backward onto 4th Dynasty pyramids, assuming they should display similar characteristics. The reality of 4th Dynasty pyramid chambers is more complex. The Great Pyramid's King's Chamber, for example, has walls of polished red granite fitted with extraordinary precision, yet it contains no decoration or inscription. The chamber is empty, except for a lidless granite box traditionally identified as a sarcophagus, though it shows none of the features typical of burial containers. The walls are smooth, but undecorated. Is this chamber finished or unfinished? It depends entirely on what we believe its purpose was. The bent pyramid's rough chamber walls might tell us more about intended function than construction status. Consider the tool marks visible throughout both chambers. These marks aren't random or chaotic. They show systematic patterns suggesting deliberate technique. The stones were worked with specific tools applied at consistent angles, creating surfaces that, while not smooth, demonstrate controlled execution. If workers simply abandoned the chambers mid-construction, you'd expect to see inconsistent work, areas at different stages of completion, or evidence of interrupted tasks. Instead, both chambers display uniform treatment throughout, suggesting the rough finish might be intentional. The corbelled ceilings provide crucial evidence about completion status. Creating these vaulted structures required sophisticated planning and precise execution. Each course of stone had to be positioned at exactly the right height and setback to create the stepped profile while maintaining structural stability. The corbelling in both the lower and upper chambers is executed flawlessly, with each course perfectly aligned and the entire vault creating a peaked ceiling that has stood stable for 4,500 years. This level of architectural sophistication argues against the chambers being abandoned mid-construction. Compare the bent pyramid's chambers to genuinely unfinished spaces elsewhere in Egypt. The Pyramid of Sekhemket at Saqqara, for example, contains passages that clearly stop mid-excavation, with rough tunnels ending abruptly and chambers only partially carved from bedrock. You can see exactly where work ceased, with one section completely finished and the next barely begun. The bent pyramid's chambers show no such discontinuity. Both spaces are complete as architectural forms, fully excavated, properly roofed, structurally sound. What they lack is surface treatment, which might not have been part of the original design. The rectangular pits in both chambers' floors deserve attention. These depressions are precisely cut, with vertical walls and flat bottoms positioned carefully within each chamber's layout. They weren't created randomly or abandoned partway through.
they're finished features whose purpose remains unclear. Some researchers suggest they were intended for sarcophagi or burial equipment, but their dimensions and positioning don't match typical burial installations. The pits might serve structural purposes, helping distribute weight or manage water drainage, or they might relate to functions we haven't considered, features whose purpose becomes clear only if we understand what these chambers were actually designed to do. The vertical shaft extending upward from the upper chamber presents another puzzle relating to completion status. This shaft is carefully cut, maintaining consistent dimensions as it rises approximately 8 meters before terminating within the pyramid's bulk. The shaft's precision argues against it being abandoned mid-construction. The cutting technique remains consistent throughout its length. Yet it leads nowhere, serving no obvious practical purpose. Is this an unfinished feature that was meant to reach the pyramid's exterior but never did? Or is it a finished feature whose purpose we simply don't understand? The absence of any ceiling or blocking in either passage is also significant. Pyramid passages were typically sealed after burial, granite plugs slid into position, corridors filled with rubble, entrances concealed. The bent pyramid's passages show no evidence of such sealing. They remain open and accessible, suggesting they never were closed because no burial requiring protection was ever installed. This openness could indicate the monument was abandoned before use, or it could mean the chambers served purposes that didn't require sealing. Let's consider an alternative interpretation. The chambers are finished, but finished for purposes different from what we expect. Ancient Egyptian architecture served multiple functions simultaneously: practical, symbolic, astronomical, and ritual. The rough walls might be intentional if the chambers were designed as acoustic spaces, where smooth surfaces would create unwanted echoes or resonance. The lack of decoration might be deliberate if these spaces served technical rather than ceremonial purposes. The empty floors and absence of installations might reflect design rather than abandonment.
This interpretation gains support from the chamber's acoustic properties. Both corbelled spaces exhibit unusual sound behavior. Low frequencies resonate strongly, creating standing waves that seem to vibrate the air itself. Voices echo in unexpected ways, with certain tones amplifying while others are dampened. These acoustic characteristics result from the chamber's specific dimensions and the rough stone surfaces. Smooth, plastered walls would significantly alter these properties. If the chambers were designed to produce particular acoustic effects, leaving the walls rough would be essential to achieving the intended result. The question of paint or plaster residue is also revealing. Many Egyptian tombs and chambers show traces of plaster, paint, or other surface treatments even when the decoration itself has been destroyed. Chemical analysis can detect these residues centuries after the visible evidence has disappeared. The bent pyramid's chambers have been examined for such traces, and results are inconclusive. Some researchers report finding minimal evidence of surface preparation, while others find none. This ambiguity suggests either the chambers never received decoration, or any surface treatment was so minimal it left no detectable trace. The chamber's orientations and positions within the pyramid might provide clues about their intended function. The lower chamber, accessed from the north, sits below ground level, with its floor carved partly from bedrock. The upper chamber, accessed from the west, is positioned within the pyramid's mass at a height corresponding to the angle change. These positions aren't random. They relate to the pyramid's overall geometry and structure in specific ways. The lower chamber's depth might relate to groundwater levels, geological features, or symbolic connections to the underworld. The upper chamber's height might connect to astronomical alignments, structural requirements, or ritual purposes tied to the pyramid's dual-angle design. Consider also what's absent from the chambers. No shaft or passage connects them to each other or to any hypothetical third chamber. No small side rooms or niches provide spaces for burial goods or ritual objects. No marks on the walls indicate where wooden structures, sarcophagi, or equipment were once installed. The chambers are simply empty spaces within the pyramid, precisely cut, structurally sophisticated, but lacking the features we associate with burial preparation. This emptiness has led some researchers to propose the chambers served as construction features rather than final installations. Perhaps they acted as stress relief spaces, reducing the weight bearing down on lower courses of stone. Perhaps they provided access for workers during construction, allowing them to monitor the structure's stability or make adjustments. But this explanation doesn't account for the corbelling sophistication or the careful integration with entrance passages. Temporary construction features wouldn't require such elaborate architectural treatment. The comparison with the Red Pyramid is instructive. Sneferu's later pyramid at Dahshur contains 3 chambers, all accessed from a single northern entrance. These chambers also have rough, undecorated walls, yet they're consistently interpreted as finished because the Red Pyramid is assumed to be Sneferu's successful final project. The rough walls in the Red Pyramid are considered a 4th dynasty characteristic, evidence that elaborate tomb decoration hadn't yet developed. But the Bent Pyramid's identical rough walls are labeled unfinished because the monument is assumed to be a failure. This inconsistent interpretation reveals how our assumptions shape our conclusions. What if both pyramids' rough chambers reflect 4th dynasty practice rather than incomplete construction? Early pyramid builders might not have decorated internal chambers because such decoration wasn't yet part of pyramid tradition. The elaborate painted tombs we associate with Egyptian burial customs developed later, during the 5th and 6th dynasties. 4th dynasty pyramids might have been designed with undecorated chambers, spaces whose rough walls were considered appropriate and complete for their intended purposes. The Bent Pyramid's chambers might also relate to the monument's possible role as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb rather than an actual burial place. Cenotaphs didn't need to accommodate physical burials, so they wouldn't require the preparation typical of actual tombs. The chambers might represent symbolic spaces, architecturally complete, but never intended for the practical functions of housing a body and burial goods. Their roughness might be irrelevant to their symbolic purpose. Modern investigation could resolve many questions about the chamber's completion status, but such investigation remains limited. Comprehensive chemical analysis of the walls could detect any traces of plaster, paint, or other surface treatments. Ground-penetrating radar could reveal whether hidden features exist within the walls or beneath the floors. Detailed acoustic mapping could document exactly how sound behaves in these spaces. Laser scanning could create precise 3D models showing every tool mark and surface irregularity. These technologies could distinguish between chambers that were abandoned mid-construction and chambers that were completed according to a design we don't yet understand. The vertical shaft in the upper chamber particularly deserves modern investigation. Does it align with any external feature of the pyramid? Does it point towards specific stars or celestial phenomena? Does it convect to any hidden space within the pyramid's bulk? Does its termination point correspond to any structural feature? These questions could be answered with appropriate scanning technology, but such work hasn't been comprehensively undertaken. The rough chamber walls of the Bent Pyramid challenge us to reconsider what finished means in ancient construction. We've assumed these spaces are incomplete because they don't match our expectations based on later tombs and different architectural traditions. But the chambers might be exactly what their builders intended: acoustically designed spaces, structurally sophisticated vaults, or symbolically significant rooms whose rough surfaces served purposes we haven't recognized. Rather than evidence of abandonment, the chambers might represent a completed design, whose function remains mysterious because we're asking the wrong questions about what these spaces were meant to do.
The Bent Pyramid's exceptional preservation offers an archaeological treasure that exists nowhere else in Egypt: the opportunity to study 4th dynasty construction techniques in remarkable detail. While most pyramids lost their smooth outer casing stones centuries ago, stripped away for use in medieval Cairo's buildings, the Bent Pyramid retains approximately 80% of its original Tura limestone exterior. This preservation allows us to examine exactly how ancient masons cut, shaped, transported, and positioned the stones that gave these monuments their gleaming surfaces. Yet despite this unique opportunity, systematic study of these construction details remains surprisingly incomplete. Walk around the bent pyramid's base, and you'll see casing stones still in their original positions, each block precisely fitted to its neighbors. The joints between stones are so tight that inserting even a thin blade becomes difficult. This precision isn't accidental. It results from deliberate techniques applied systematically across the entire structure. The outer face of each casing stone was dressed smooth after installation, creating the continuous surface that gave the pyramid its finished appearance. But examine the stones closely, and subtle details reveal the construction process. Tool marks on individual stones tell stories about ancient cutting techniques. The casing blocks show evidence of copper or bronze tools applied at specific angles, creating systematic patterns across the stone's surface. Some marks indicate sawing motions, suggesting workers used copper saws, possibly enhanced with quartz sand as an abrasive. Other marks show pounding or pecking techniques, where workers struck the stone repeatedly with harder materials to shape it gradually. The patterns aren't random. They demonstrate methodical approaches to stone shaping, with workers following consistent techniques to achieve desired results. The size and weight of individual casing stones present logistical challenges that ancient builders had to overcome. Each block typically measures between 1 and 2 meters along its edges and weighs approximately 2 to 5 tons. The Tour limestone quarries, source of the pyramid's casing stones, lie on the Nile's east bank, approximately 15 kilometers from Dahshur. Transporting these massive blocks required sophisticated planning, loading them onto boats for the river crossing, then moving them overland to the construction site. The logistics of managing thousands of such blocks, delivering them in the correct sequence for installation, and positioning them with millimeter precision represents an organizational achievement as impressive as the architectural result. The casing stone's rear surfaces, the faces not visible externally, show different treatment than their smooth outer faces. These hidden surfaces are rougher, with less careful finishing, because they didn't require the precision of the exterior face. This differential treatment demonstrates efficiency. Workers invested effort where it mattered for the final appearance, while economizing on surfaces that would never be seen. The rough rear surfaces also facilitated bonding with the pyramid's inner core stones, providing grip that helped lock the casing layer to the underlying structure.
The core masonry, the internal bulk of the pyramid, hidden beneath the casing stones, consists of local limestone quarried near the construction site. These core blocks are rougher and less regularly shaped than the casing stones, reflecting their role as structural fill rather than finished surface. The core blocks show evidence of different quarrying techniques, with some stones bearing marks of wedge splitting, a method where workers drove wooden wedges into natural cracks in the limestone, then soaked the wedges with water. As the wood expanded, it split the rock along desired planes. This technique allowed efficient quarrying of large quantities of building stone without requiring the precision necessary for casing blocks. The relationship between core and casing reveals important construction details. The casing stones weren't applied to a completed core pyramid like a decorative wrapper. Instead, casing and core were built simultaneously, with each course of casing stones installed along with its corresponding course of core blocks. This integrated construction method means the casing stones structurally bond to the core, helping distribute loads and maintain stability. You can see this bonding at areas where casing stones have fallen away, revealing how the smooth outer blocks interlock with the rougher internal masonry. The mortar used between stones deserves attention. Egyptian pyramid builders employed gypsum-based mortar that served primarily as lubricant during stone positioning rather than as adhesive. The mortar's thinness, often just millimeters, allowed workers to slide heavy blocks into precise position while the mortar remained workable. Once it set, the mortar helped distribute loads across the joint surface, but the stone's weight and careful fitting provided the primary structural connection. Chemical analysis of mortar samples could reveal information about ancient materials and techniques, but comprehensive sampling across the bent pyramid hasn't been systematically undertaken. The angle transition between the pyramid's lower and upper sections presents particular construction challenges. At this point, workers had to shift from positioning stones at 54 degrees to 43 degrees while maintaining the pyramid's square profile and structural integrity. This transition required precise calculation. Each course above the angle change needed different dimensions than courses below to maintain the new slope. The smoothness of this transition, visible in the intact casing stones, demonstrates sophisticated geometric understanding and careful execution during construction. One of the most intriguing construction details involves the backing stones, the final course of core masonry that the casing stones rest against. These backing stones were cut at specific angles to match the intended casing slope, creating angled surfaces against which the outer blocks were positioned. At the bent pyramid, you can observe backing stones cut at both 54 and 43 degrees, corresponding to the lower and upper sections. This careful preparation of backing stones proves the angle change was planned and executed systematically rather than improvised hastily during construction. The pyramid's corners show particularly sophisticated construction. At each corner, casing stones from two faces meet, requiring precise cutting to create clean edges that maintain both faces' slopes. The cornerstones demonstrate extraordinary precision. Their edges are straight, their angles exact, their surfaces smooth.
Creating these cornerstones required workers to calculate and cut stones that satisfied multiple geometric requirements simultaneously. The corner's quality throughout both the lower and upper sections confirms that craftsmanship remained consistent despite the angle change. Evidence of construction organization can be found in subtle variations within the stonework. Some researchers have identified quarry marks or mason's marks on individual blocks, simple symbols painted or carved into stone surfaces, possibly indicating which work gang cut or positioned each block. These marks could provide information about labor organization, construction sequencing, and the number of teams working simultaneously. However, systematic documentation of such marks across the bent pyramid remains incomplete, representing another missed opportunity to understand ancient construction methods. The remarkable preservation also allows study of weathering patterns that reveal information about construction timing. Stone exposed to the elements immediately after quarrying develops weathering characteristics different from stone that was quarried and then stored before installation. By analyzing weathering patterns on individual casing stones, researchers might determine whether the pyramid was built continuously or whether construction paused, with some stones installed fresh from the quarry, while others waited months or years before positioning. Such analysis could help establish construction timelines and determine whether the monument was built as rapidly as some estimates suggest. The foundation deserves particular attention because it represents a construction achievement often overlooked. The bent pyramid sits on relatively soft ground, sand and clay, rather than the solid bedrock supporting the Giza pyramids. Building a stable foundation on such material required techniques that prevented settling and maintained level surfaces capable of supporting millions of tons. The builders apparently excavated trenches around the pyramid's perimeter, filling them with sand and gravel to create a more stable base. The center of the pyramid sits directly on harder substrate, while the edges rest on these prepared foundation trenches. This technique distributed weight effectively while accommodating the ground conditions, an engineering solution that has kept the pyramid stable for 4,500 years. The construction ramps that would have been necessary to build the pyramid have long since disappeared, leaving only indirect evidence of their existence. Various theories propose different ramp configurations: straight ramps extending from one side, spiral ramps wrapping around the pyramid, or internal ramps built into the structure itself. The bent pyramid's dual entrances, particularly the high western entrance, might provide clues about ramp positions.
If workers needed to access the western entrance during construction, ramps or scaffolding would have required specific configurations. The western entrance's position just below the angle change suggests ramps might have been modified or repositioned at this height, possibly relating to the construction phasing that created the two different slopes. Tool evidence provides crucial information about ancient capabilities and limitations. The copper or bronze tools available to 4th Dynasty workers were softer than the limestone and granite they shaped, creating an apparent paradox. How do you cut stone with tools softer than the stone itself?
The answer involves abrasives, particularly quartz sand, which is harder than both copper tools and limestone. Workers probably used copper saws with sand slurry, where the copper tool held the sand in place while the sand grains did the actual cutting. This technique explains the tool mark's characteristics and the precision achievable with apparently inadequate tools. The absence of iron tools is significant. Iron technology hadn't yet developed in 4th Dynasty Egypt, limiting workers to copper, bronze, and stone tools. This limitation makes the precision of the casing stones even more impressive. Achieving such tight joints and smooth surfaces with relatively soft copper tools required exceptional skill and patience. The tool mark's systematic patterns suggest workers developed efficient techniques that maximized their tools' effectiveness despite the material limitations. One construction detail that deserves more attention is the sequence of surface finishing. The casing stone's outer faces show different finishing stages. Some blocks display the rough tool marks of initial shaping, while others show progressive smoothing where workers refined the surface in multiple passes. At some locations, you can see where workers began smoothing but didn't complete the process, leaving clear evidence of the finishing sequence. This partial finishing might indicate areas where construction ceased before final surface treatment, or it might reflect deliberate choices about which surfaces required complete finishing. The corbelled chamber's construction presents unique challenges. Creating these vaulted spaces required building techniques different from the pyramid's external courses. Each corbel course had to be positioned precisely while maintaining structural stability before the next course was added. Workers probably used wooden supports or scaffolding within the chambers during construction, though no traces of such temporary structures remain. The corbelling's precision, each course projecting inward by carefully calculated amounts, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of structural forces and geometric principles. Modern construction experts attempting to replicate ancient techniques have found that achieving similar results requires not just appropriate tools and materials, but also substantial skill developed through experience. The tight joints between casing stones aren't simply the result of careful measuring. They require understanding how limestone responds to different cutting techniques, how blocks settle under their own weight, and how slight adjustments during positioning can affect final fit. 4th Dynasty masons possessed this experiential knowledge, accumulated through years of training and practice, allowing them to achieve results that modern workers with power tools sometimes struggle to match. The bent pyramid's construction techniques reveal a civilization with sophisticated understanding of materials, geometry, and large-scale project organization. Yet despite the monument's exceptional preservation offering unprecedented opportunities to study these techniques, systematic investigation remains incomplete. We possess a textbook in stone demonstrating 4th Dynasty capabilities, but we haven't fully read its lessons. The construction details visible in preserved casing stones, the tool marks on individual blocks, the sophisticated foundation engineering, all these features deserve comprehensive modern study that could transform our understanding of ancient Egyptian building methods and organizational capabilities.
Hidden within the bent pyramid's corbelled chambers lies evidence that rarely appears in discussions of pyramid construction: ancient wooden beams embedded in the masonry. These aren't decorative elements or symbolic installations. They're structural components integrated into the architecture during the original construction. The beams consist of cedar wood imported from Lebanon,
transported hundreds of kilometers to be incorporated into a monument built primarily of local stone. Their presence raises questions about construction techniques, about timber's role in pyramid engineering, and most intriguingly, about why such valuable imported materials were used in locations where they would never be seen once construction was complete. The cedar beams appear in both the lower and upper chambers, positioned within the corbelled ceiling structures. As each corbel course was laid, wooden beams were placed horizontally across the chamber width, embedded within the masonry itself. These beams weren't simply laid on top of stone courses, they were integrated into the structure, with limestone blocks positioned around and above them. The beams extend through the corbelling from one side of the chamber to the other, creating a wooden framework within the stone vault. Why incorporate wooden beams into stone architecture? The conventional explanation suggests the beams served as sintering, temporary supports holding the corbelled stones in position during construction until the mortar set and the structure became self-supporting. But this interpretation struggles to explain why the beams remain in place rather than being removed after construction. If they were merely temporary scaffolding, workers could have withdrawn them once the corbelling was complete. Instead, the beams were deliberately left embedded within the masonry, suggesting they served ongoing structural purposes rather than temporary construction needs. The choice of cedar is significant. Lebanon cedar was one of the most prized materials in the ancient world. Strong, durable, naturally resistant to decay and insect damage. Egyptian texts and records frequently mention cedar wood imports, noting their value for shipbuilding, temple construction, and elite architecture. The material was expensive, requiring extensive trade networks and significant resources to obtain. Using such valuable timber for structural elements that would remain hidden within a pyramid's interior demonstrates either enormous wealth dedicated to the project or a specific engineering requirement that justified the expense. The beam's positioning within the corbelling provides clues about their function. They're placed at regular intervals as the corbelled ceiling rises, creating horizontal reinforcement throughout the vault structure. This placement suggests the beams help distribute loads, preventing the corbel courses from spreading outward under the immense weight of stone above. Wood possesses flexibility that stone lacks. It can bend slightly under load without fracturing, potentially helping the structure accommodate small movements or settlements that would crack purely stone construction. The beams might act as tension members, holding the corbelled sides together and preventing the vault from collapsing outward. Modern structural analysis could clarify the beam's engineering role, but such analysis remains limited. Computer modeling could simulate how the chambers behave with and without the wooden reinforcement, revealing whether the beams provide essential structural support or merely redundant backup to an already stable stone vault. Physical testing of wood samples could determine their strength characteristics and how they've changed over 45 centuries. Yet comprehensive engineering studies of the bent pyramid's timber elements haven't been systematically undertaken, leaving their structural function debated rather than definitively understood. The preservation state of these ancient beams varies. Some sections remain remarkably intact, showing original wood grain and structure. Other sections have deteriorated, with wood turning dark and brittle from age and environmental exposure. The variation in preservation might relate to different conditions within the two chambers. Humidity levels, air circulation, and temperature fluctuations all affect wood decay rates over millennia. Areas where beams remain better preserved might indicate portions of the chambers that stayed drier or more stable environmentally. Carbon dating of the cedar beams offers crucial chronological information. In the 1980s and 1990s, small samples from the bent pyramid's timbers were subjected to radiocarbon analysis, yielding dates that broadly align with Sneferu's reign around 2600 BCE. These dates provide some of the most direct evidence for the pyramid's construction period, since the timbers were cut and installed during building, rather than being later additions. But the radiocarbon dating comes with uncertainties. The results provide ranges rather than precise years,
and questions remain about which specific beams were sampled and how representative those samples are of all the timber used in construction. The dating results also reveal interesting patterns. Some beam samples produce dates slightly earlier than Sneferu's conventional rain dates, while others align more precisely. This variation might indicate that timber was stockpiled before use, trees cut down years before they were incorporated into the pyramid. Ancient construction projects didn't necessarily use freshly cut materials. Valuable resources like Lebanon cedar might be acquired opportunistically and stored until needed. Alternatively, the date variations might simply reflect the uncertainties inherent in carbon dating, where results must be calibrated against tree ring sequences and other chronological markers. The Lebanon connection adds another layer of significance. Ancient Egyptian expeditions to the Levantine coast seeking cedar are well documented in historical texts. The famous Palermo stone, an ancient king list and annal, records such expeditions during earlier dynasties. By Sneferu's time, trade routes to Lebanon were well established, with Egyptian ships sailing to ports like Byblos to acquire timber. The cedar beams in the bent pyramid represent physical evidence of these long-distance trade networks, demonstrating the resources 4th dynasty pharaohs could mobilize for their construction projects. But here's a detail that deserves more attention. Not all pyramids contain such extensive timber reinforcement. The Great Pyramid at Giza, built by Sneferu's son Khufu, includes some wooden elements in its upper chambers, but not the systematic timber framework seen in the bent pyramid's corbelling. Other 4th dynasty pyramids show limited use of wood, primarily in door mechanisms or as relieving elements above passages. The bent pyramid's extensive incorporation of cedar beams appears unusual, suggesting specific structural requirements or engineering approaches particular to this monument.
Some researchers have proposed that the extensive timber use relates to the pyramid's foundation challenges. Building on relatively soft ground rather than solid bedrock might have required additional structural flexibility that wood could provide. The beams could help the chambers accommodate slight settlements or movements in the underlying substrate without catastrophic failure. This interpretation would explain why later pyramids built on better foundations didn't require such extensive timber reinforcement. Another theory suggests the beams relate to the angle change. If structural concerns motivated the slow production, perhaps engineers incorporated timber reinforcement into the corbelled chambers to prevent the kind of failure they feared. The beams would provide additional structural safety, ensuring the chambers remained stable even if the pyramid's overall mass created forces that pure stone construction couldn't safely manage. This theory connects the timber use to the angle change mystery, suggesting both features result from a coordinated engineering response to specific structural challenges. The condition of accessible beams has raised preservation concerns. Wooden elements in ancient structures are vulnerable to environmental changes, particularly fluctuations in humidity and temperature. The bent pyramid's chambers were sealed for millennia, maintaining relatively stable conditions that helped preserve the timbers. Modern tourism and investigation have altered these conditions. Increased air circulation, higher carbon dioxide levels from visitors' breath, and temperature changes from artificial lighting all affect wood preservation. Egyptian authorities have responded by limiting access and installing environmental monitoring systems, but questions remain about long-term preservation strategies for these ancient timbers. The beams also provide information about ancient woodworking techniques. The timbers were shaped using copper or bronze tools, axes for felling trees, adzes for removing bark and shaping surfaces, saws for cutting to length. Tool marks visible on some beam sections reveal the methods used to prepare the wood. The beam's dimensions show standardization, suggesting workers followed consistent sizing specifications rather than cutting each piece individually. This standardization implies organized planning, with timber requirements calculated in advance and materials prepared to specification before installation. One intriguing question involves whether any organic material remains embedded with the timbers. Ancient construction sometimes used natural fibers, resins, or other organic materials as packing, sealing, or waterproofing. If such materials exist within the bent pyramid's chambers around the cedar beams, they could provide additional samples for carbon dating and chemical analysis. Modern investigation techniques like microsampling and non-destructive scanning could detect such materials without requiring extensive excavation or dismantling of the structure. The symbolic significance of cedar shouldn't be overlooked. In ancient Egyptian thought, Lebanon cedar was associated with permanence, strength, and divine favor. The wood's natural fragrance and resistance to decay made it symbolically appropriate for sacred architecture. Using cedar in the pyramid's hidden interior might have served ritual or religious purposes beyond mere engineering, imbuing the structure with materials considered specially blessed or powerful. This symbolic dimension would help explain why such expensive materials were used in locations where they wouldn't be visible. Comparing the bent pyramid's timber use to other ancient structures provides broader context. Temple construction throughout Egyptian history incorporated cedar wood, particularly for roof beams, columns, and door elements. The durability of cedar made it suitable for long-term structural applications in monumental architecture. However, pyramids generally used wood more sparingly than temples, making the bent pyramid's extensive timber incorporation noteworthy. This difference might reflect the pyramid's specific engineering challenges or particular construction philosophy applied during Sneferu's reign. The possibility of additional hidden timber elements raises tantalizing questions. If beams are visible in the accessible chambers, might similar timber reinforcement exist elsewhere in the pyramid structure, in walls, beneath floors, or in portions of the monument that haven't been explored? Ground-penetrating radar or other non-invasive scanning techniques might detect wooden elements within solid masonry, revealing the full extent of timber use in the pyramid's construction. Such discoveries could transform our understanding of Fourth Dynasty engineering methods and the role of wood in pyramid architecture. The cedar beams also connect to broader questions about resource management and construction logistics. How much timber did the entire project require? How many trees were felled in Lebanon forests? How many ships transported wood across the Mediterranean? How were the beams stored at the construction site? How did workers coordinate timber installation with stone courses during corbelling construction? These practical questions about ancient project management remain largely unexplored, yet answering them could illuminate Fourth Dynasty organizational capabilities and economic reach. Future investigation should prioritize comprehensive documentation of all visible timbers, detailed photography, 3D scanning, measurement of dimensions and positioning, assessment of preservation state. Additional radiocarbon sampling from multiple beams in both chambers could refine chronological estimates and reveal whether all chambers date to the same period or were installed over an extended construction timeline. Structural analysis modeling how the chambers behave with and without timber reinforcement could definitively establish whether the beams provide essential support or merely redundant backup. Chemical analysis of wood composition could reveal information about growth conditions in ancient Lebanon forests and environmental changes over millennia. The cedar beams embedded within the bent pyramid's corbelled chambers represent a detail often omitted from pyramid discussions, a feature mentioned briefly if at all, then set aside in favor of more visible architectural elements. Yet these wooden components might hold keys to understanding Fourth Dynasty engineering, trade networks, construction methods, and structural innovation. They deserve attention proportional to their significance, not as curiosities, but as crucial evidence illuminating ancient capabilities and design choices that remain incompletely understood.
Stand in the bent pyramid's lower chamber and speak. Your voice behaves strangely. Certain frequencies seem to resonate powerfully, vibrating the air in ways that feel almost physical, while other tones are dampened or absorbed. Whisper, and the sound carries with unexpected clarity. Produce a low hum, and the corbelled chamber responds, amplifying the tone until the space itself seems to vibrate. This isn't imagination or a subjective impression. It's measurable acoustic behavior, resulting from the chamber's specific dimensions, the rough stone surfaces, and the geometric properties of the corbelled vault. Yet these acoustic characteristics rarely appear in discussions of the bent pyramid, as if the way sound behaves in these ancient spaces is somehow less important than their visual or structural properties. The acoustic properties of pyramid chambers have gained attention in recent decades, particularly regarding the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber, where researchers have documented resonant frequencies and unusual sound behavior. But the bent pyramid's chambers possess their own distinctive acoustic signatures that differ from those at Giza. The lower chamber, positioned partially below ground with its corbelled ceiling rising 17 meters, creates a resonant space that responds particularly to low frequencies. The upper chamber, positioned higher in the pyramid's mass with similar corbelling, displays related but distinct acoustic characteristics. These differences suggest that chamber position, surrounding mass, and specific dimensions all influence how sound behaves in confined spaces within massive stone structures. The corbelled ceiling design contributes significantly to acoustic properties. Unlike a flat ceiling that would create simple parallel reflections, the corbelled creates a complex pattern of reflections at multiple angles. Sound waves striking the corbelled surfaces bounce back at varying trajectories, creating interference patterns where waves reinforce or cancel each other depending on frequency. This geometric complexity means certain frequencies resonate strongly, their wavelengths matching the chamber dimensions in ways that create standing waves, while other frequencies are dampened or scattered. Researchers who have conducted acoustic measurements in the lower chamber report that frequencies around 70 to 80 Hz produce particularly strong resonance. This falls into the low bass range, below the fundamental frequency of most human speech, but within the range of chanting, drumming, or other ritual sound production. When sound at these resonant frequencies fills the chamber, the effect is remarkable. The entire space seems to vibrate, and people present report feeling the vibration in their chests and bodies, not just hearing it with their ears. This physical sensation results from the air pressure variations created by standing waves at resonant frequencies. The rough and unfinished walls that we discussed in an earlier episode as possibly intentional rather than incomplete take on new significance when considering acoustics. Smooth plaster walls would create strong, direct reflections, potentially making the chambers reverberant to the point of distorting sound. The rough limestone surfaces scatter sound in multiple directions, reducing harsh reflections while maintaining resonance at specific frequencies. If the chambers were designed for acoustic purposes, spaces where sound played an important role, leaving the walls rough would be essential to achieving desired acoustic properties. The unfinished appearance might actually represent sophisticated acoustic engineering. The comparison between the lower and upper chamber's acoustics reveals intriguing differences. The lower chamber, surrounded by more mass and positioned partially underground, tends toward lower resonant frequencies. The upper chamber, positioned higher with less surrounding mass, resonates at slightly higher frequencies. These differences aren't random. They result from how chamber dimensions and surrounding conditions affect acoustic behavior. If someone designed these spaces with specific acoustic properties in mind, they demonstrated understanding of how position and mass influence resonance. The vertical shaft extending upward from the upper chamber adds acoustic complexity. Sound can travel up the shaft, creating a kind of acoustic channel between the chamber and whatever space the shaft connects to, even though it terminates within the pyramid's bulk rather than reaching the exterior. The shaft's dimensions would influence which frequencies could propagate effectively through it, potentially creating a filtering effect. If the shaft was intended to reach the pyramid's exterior, but construction stopped short, it would have connected the chamber acoustically to the outside air, drastically changing the space's acoustic properties. Ancient Egyptian ritual often incorporated sound. Chanting, music, and spoken incantations were essential elements of religious practice. Temple spaces were designed with acoustic considerations, though this aspect of ancient architecture is often overlooked in favor of visual and symbolic analysis. If pyramid chambers served ritual purposes, their acoustic properties wouldn't be incidental, but central to their function. The bent pyramid's chambers might have been designed as spaces where specific sounds could be produced for ritual purposes, with the corbelling and rough walls creating acoustic conditions appropriate to those practices. Some researchers have explored connections between pyramid chamber acoustics and altered states of consciousness. Exposure to sustained low-frequency sound, particularly in confined spaces, can influence human perception and mental state. Frequencies in the 70 to 80 Hz range have been associated in modern studies with feelings of awe, presence, or transcendence, effects that might have ritual significance in ancient religious contexts. If priests or participants experienced these effects during ceremonies in the bent pyramid's chambers, it might explain why such spaces were considered sacred or powerful, regardless of whether ancient builders consciously understood the physical mechanisms creating these experiences.
The acoustic properties also raise questions about the chamber's emptiness. An empty stone chamber has different acoustic characteristics than one containing wooden structures, fabric hangings, or other materials that would absorb or scatter sound. The current acoustic measurements reflect empty chambers. But if these spaces originally contained installations or furnishings, the acoustic properties would have been different. However, the absence of any evidence for such installations suggests the chambers might always have been empty, designed specifically to create the acoustic effects measurable today. The cedar beams embedded in the corbelling could influence acoustic properties in subtle ways. Wood absorbs sound differently than stone, potentially damping certain frequencies or affecting how the corbelled vault resonates. The beam's positioning at regular intervals throughout the corbelling might create periodic absorption or reflection points that influence standing wave patterns. Comprehensive acoustic modeling that accounts for the timber elements could reveal whether they play significant acoustic roles beyond their structural function. Comparing the bent pyramid's acoustics to other pyramid chambers provides context. The Great Pyramid's King's Chamber, built entirely of red granite rather than limestone, has different acoustic characteristics. Granite's greater density and hardness create different reflection and resonance properties. The bent pyramid's limestone chambers with embedded cedar beams create a unique acoustic environment not duplicated elsewhere in pyramid architecture. This uniqueness might be coincidental, resulting from the structure's unusual features serving other purposes, or it might indicate deliberate acoustic design distinguishing this monument from others. Modern acoustic investigation of ancient structures has revealed that many supposedly utilitarian spaces possess sophisticated sound properties. Medieval cathedrals, for example, were designed with acoustic considerations, ensuring music and speech carried effectively throughout vast interiors. Neolithic structures like Newgrange in Ireland demonstrate acoustic engineering predating the pyramids by centuries. Ancient builders across cultures understood sound behavior and incorporated acoustic principles into architecture. The idea that 4th Dynasty Egyptians might have designed pyramid chambers with acoustic considerations isn't far-fetched. It aligns with known ancient capabilities and the evidence of sophisticated understanding demonstrated in other aspects of pyramid construction. The question of intentionality is crucial. Did the bent pyramid's builders deliberately design chambers with specific acoustic properties, or are the measured acoustic effects simply coincidental results of dimensions chosen for other reasons? This question is difficult to answer definitively without additional evidence about ancient design intentions. However, several factors suggest intentional acoustic design might have played a role.
The consistency of resonant frequencies between chambers of similar design, the acoustic advantages of rough rather than smooth walls, the positioning of chambers that create different acoustic environments, these patterns suggest awareness of acoustic principles, even if ancient builders understood them differently than modern acousticians do. The limited research on pyramid acoustics reflects broader gaps in how ancient architecture is studied. Archaeological investigation traditionally emphasizes visual elements, decorations, inscriptions, structural features, while treating acoustic properties as incidental. Sound doesn't leave physical traces the way inscriptions do, making it harder to study and easier to overlook. But for ancient people using these spaces, sound would have been as important as sight. The acoustic environment would have shaped how they experienced the chambers, influenced ritual effectiveness, and contributed to the space's perceived sacred power. Modern technology could dramatically expand our understanding of the bent pyramid's acoustic properties. Detailed acoustic mapping using multiple microphones positioned throughout the chambers could document exactly how sound behaves at every frequency and location. Computer modeling could simulate how acoustic properties would change if chambers contained various installations or if environmental conditions differed. Comparison with acoustic measurements from other pyramid chambers and ancient structures could reveal whether the bent pyramid's acoustic signatures are unique or part of broader patterns in ancient architecture. The role of the two separate chamber systems in creating different acoustic environments deserves investigation. If someone entering the northern entrance experienced the lower chamber's acoustic properties, while someone using the western entrance encountered the upper chamber's different acoustic characteristics, this could represent deliberate design, creating distinct acoustic spaces for different purposes or experiences. The chamber's isolation from each other means their acoustic environments don't influence each other, maintaining separate sound spaces within the same monument. Cultural context is essential for interpreting acoustic properties. Ancient Egyptian religious texts frequently reference the power of spoken words, the importance of proper vocal formulas, and the sacred nature of certain sounds. The opening of the mouth ceremony, crucial for enabling the deceased to speak and eat in the afterlife, centered on spoken incantations and ritual sounds. If pyramid chambers served ritual purposes related to such practices, acoustic properties ensuring proper transmission and resonance of sacred sounds would be essential features rather than incidental characteristics. The silence of modern academic discussion about the bent pyramid's acoustic properties mirrors broader patterns of neglect regarding this monument. Just as the angle change gets dismissed as a construction error, the dual entrances as confused planning, and the rough chambers as incomplete work, the acoustic properties remain unexamined and unexplained. A pattern emerges. Features that don't fit conventional interpretation tend to be minimized or ignored rather than investigated as potential clues to purposes and capabilities we haven't recognized. Yet the acoustic evidence is undeniable. Stand in those corbelled chambers and produce sound, and the spaces respond in distinctive, measurable ways. These aren't subtle effects requiring sophisticated equipment to detect. They're powerful enough that ancient people would certainly have noticed, and potentially incorporated them into how the spaces were used. The question isn't whether acoustic properties exist, but whether they were intended, and if so, what role they played in the monument's design and function. The bent pyramid's acoustic secrets remain largely unstudied. Another example of how this monument continues to be overlooked despite holding information that could transform our understanding of ancient capabilities. The chamber's distinctive sound behavior, the influence of corbel geometry, the effects of rough stone surfaces and embedded timber, all these factors create acoustic environments worthy of comprehensive investigation. Perhaps when we finally take the bent pyramid seriously as an intentional design rather than a historical failure, its acoustic properties will receive the attention they deserve, revealing purposes and sophistication that conventional interpretation has missed.
We've journeyed through the bent pyramid's secrets, the precise angle change that defies the construction error narrative, the dual entrance system found nowhere else in pyramid architecture, The chambers dismissed as unfinished despite their sophisticated corbelling. The construction techniques visible in exceptionally preserved casing stones. The cedar beams imported from Lebanon and embedded where they'd never be seen, and the acoustic properties that transform these spaces into resonant chambers. Each feature challenges conventional interpretation. Each detail suggests intentional design rather than desperate improvisation. Yet the bent pyramid remains relegated to footnote status in pyramid studies, mentioned briefly as a transitional failure before moving on to discuss successful monuments at Giza. Why does this silence persist? Why did tour groups bypass Dahshur for Giza? Why did documentaries dedicate minutes rather than hours to this remarkably preserved monument? Why do academic investigations remain limited despite the unique opportunities the bent pyramid offers for studying 4th Dynasty construction methods? The answer lies not in the monument itself, but in how we approach ancient achievements. Our need for neat narratives, our discomfort with anomalies, our tendency to dismiss what doesn't fit established frameworks. The bent pyramid's secrets remain secrets not because evidence is lacking, but because asking uncomfortable questions about this failed pyramid might force us to reconsider everything we think we know about pyramid construction, purpose, and the capabilities of ancient builders who continue to surprise us when we finally pay attention.